Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to continue the series that we started earlier this week, and we are talking about popular arguments against the Christian faith from skeptics. We are dealing primarily with kind of popular level issues that are raised by, the atheists that you might just run across in everyday life and might challenge you on certain questions. So the question that we're going to deal with today is the God of the gaps. Now, there's this idea out there called the God of the gaps, which basically says this, that humankind created this idea of God to explain the things in nature that we had not been able to previously explain through science. So when we saw things that we couldn't explain, we would say things like, well, the gods must have done it. So we've got lightning, it's coming from the sky, and we must reason, therefore, that, hey, maybe Zeus has lightning bolts and he's throwing them from the sky, and that's where this comes from. And then as science progressed and explained more and more, now we have less gaps, and so we have less of a room for God. And so the argument is that what Christians, or those who affirm the existence of God, different kinds of theists, what we do is say, well, there are still a few things in science we can't explain, even though we can explain so much. And so we're going to kind of put God in that place and say that, God is the explanation for X, Y, or Z. Now, there is a fundamental problem in this explanation of the view of Christianity and other faiths regarding the existence of God and the very nature of God. And that is that this assumes an idea about God and his essence and his nature that is fundamentally mistaken. And what I would argue is that this does not disprove any existence of the biblical God or the God of what is often called classical theism, in which there is a kind of identity of the nature of God in some sense, even across various theistic traditions. Now, of course, as a Christian, I believe that to be the biblical triune God. But there even is agreement of pagan philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and a lot of even different theistic faiths regarding some of the basic characteristics of God. And when we look at some of those basic characteristics of God, they really simply don't make sense with this God of the gaps idea. So what the God of the gaps idea proposes is that God's function is within basically this closed system, this closed universe where the scientific laws are, and God then is some kind of being just like all of the other beings, just like I am a being, just like you are a being, and this God, then his role is to kind of fill in the gaps and do some supernatural things every once in a while where science really just simply can't explain it. This does happen to an extent even within the intelligent design movement and others. Well, I think they have a lot of valid arguments, and in terms of the inadequacy of the explanations posed by Darwinism, I think that there is a tendency even in that movement to leave some kind of a room for an idea of God that is just somebody who's kind of filling in the gaps. In other words, well, this idea of evolution makes sense. We don't know how this makes sense. Therefore, we're going to say that God is the one who fills that gap. Okay, that's kind of at least the popular explanation. I think intelligent design is much more sophisticated than that. But I think that a certain understanding of intelligent design can lead to this kind of idea of God, because it's not really defining who the God is, just that there is some kind of a designer that's got to fill in the gaps here and there. But the biblical conception of God, and this conception of God that is within classical theism as a whole, is not that God is just kind of this being in the universe, or just kind of this greatest being in the universe. Maybe I'm down here and God is up here. He's a greater being than me. But instead, God himself is being itself. God is the very source of being. God is the very source and foundation of existence and consciousness and morality. All of these things find their telos, their rootedness in God himself. And what this means is that it really is not relevant to the question of classical theism whether or not science has explanatory value, or even the extent of that explanatory value of science. because what we want to do is get behind the idea of scientific laws altogether. We're not asking the question of, well, how can you explain scientifically how this something could have possibly come from this and how things developed. And no matter what you want to prove on that front, it doesn't really answer the fundamental questions that Christian theism is really asking. And those fundamental questions of Christian theism have to do with the God who is behind all of reality. Because even if you get to scientific laws, say scientific laws can explain nearly everything that exists in the observable universe. Well, that still doesn't explain the transcendental conditions necessary for scientific laws themselves to exist. And so the scientific laws point to the lawgiver who is behind those very laws. And we have to get behind the question of being itself to see God is the very foundation of being, the very foundation of motion in the universe, of cause in the universe. That not everything in the universe is contingent. You cannot have only contingent things in the universe. You have to have something behind that that is not contingent. And that is the place of God. And so you have this transcendental question, metaphysical question of being that relates to God that simply is not addressed by science. You see, the problem is that we think that the scientific method has this complete explanatory value, that it explains everything that we could possibly want to know about life. And that's simply not what science does. Now, science is certainly valuable in what it does, but it does not replace all these other fields of knowledge. It doesn't replace theology or philosophy. So, for example, science does not actually give us, if we're saying the scientific method explains everything, does the scientific method explain the scientific method? Can you defend the scientific method by the scientific method? Well, no. That's circular reasoning. Of course, you can't. Because we have to take these ideas, they're ideas that we come to our experiences with, these transcendental concepts without which experience is impossible. And there are things that we take for granted that we don't even consider. We take for granted the reliability of our sense experience. That what I perceive outside of my body, what I see and hear and touch, that actually relates to something outside of myself. That I'm not fooling myself in thinking that this is really all that's outside of me, that really all of this is just in my head. To say that there's no desk in front of me, I feel it. We have to make assumptions, and science cannot prove the reality of my consciousness. Science cannot prove the reality that things exist outside of me. Science cannot prove the idea that other minds exist, right? I cannot experience your consciousness, and I cannot get inside of your mind to know that your mind actually exists. I assume that that is the case. And so science can't explain everything. And this is the problem, is that in our modern age, we've tried to make science just kind of this all-explanatory subject that every single question about humanity that we ever raise could be answered with science. And it's simply not the case. We assume all sorts of things that cannot be explained by science. And so God is not merely one figure within the laws of nature and the laws of science, whose role is simply to fill in the gaps where other things are not able to do so. God is one who stands outside of the realm of nature, completely outside of nature, one who is omnipresent, omniscient, behind all things, the source of all things, and the thing to which all things flow. And if that is the case, we simply cannot disprove him using the scientific method, because the scientific method is something that exists within the universe that God himself created, that he is bigger than. So it doesn't matter what kind of explanatory value science has, it simply cannot address that particular question of the nature of God. And so the God of the Gaps argument, what it does is it assumes a false understanding of who God is. An understanding of who God is that is something more like Zeus than it is like the God of Christianity.